Today, about 10% of electricity around the world comes from nuclear reactors. That's not a huge amount, but it's enough to create a significant amount of waste. Actually, it's more accurate to call it spent or used nuclear fuel, because waste is a slightly different thing. But anyway, a lot of energy can still be extracted from this spent fuel. In fact, 90% remains unused, even if the fuel remains in the reactor for a whole 5 years. However, instead of continuing to get energy from the fuel or sending it for recycling to get more fuel and byproducts, people label it as spent and send it off for disposal. Is there a good reason for this? And why don't people reuse nuclear fuel more often? Let's find out. But first, coffee. Just an unobtrusive reminder for those who forget to like the video at the end, don't forget to do that. And thanks to those who respect my wish to stay anonymous. Not too long ago, we made a video about what happens to nuclear fuel after it runs its course inside the reactor. For those who missed it or are just finding our channel for the first time, let me explain briefly. Any nuclear fuel comes into the reactor in solid form, fuel rods, and leaves it in solid form too. After the fuel has served its purpose, in most countries it's stored in concrete pools lined with steel and water. Later, they take it out of these pools, if possible, and put it into dry storage containers made of steel and concrete or other materials used for protective shielding. In the end, most of the spent fuel in the US, for example, is stored relatively safely at over 70 reactor sites across the country. The states, as well as other countries, are also looking into ideas for centralized underground storage where nuclear waste could be tucked away for hundreds of years without harming the environment. We've talked about this already, and if you're interested, there's a video on the channel. Let's move on. Instead of just storing spent fuel, theoretically, it can also be reprocessed. But very, very few countries actually do this. The list includes Japan, Russia, the Netherlands, Australia, Italy, Germany, Belgium, Switzerland, and recently China as well. Not all of them handle the reprocessing themselves. Sometimes the fuel gets sent from one country to another to be processed at someone else's plant. But that being said, France is the leader in nuclear fuel recycling. If we take a look at the 2020 stats, we'll see, well, what exactly will we see? The largest facility for recycling spent nuclear fuel in the world was the plant in La Hague, located right in France and operated by Orano Group. Its annual output was 1,700 metric tons. Next up on the list of major processing facilities was the Sellafield plant in the United Kingdom with an output of 1,500 metric tons a year. The total output for processing in the UK that year was 2,100 metric tons. Russia's become the third country on this list with a total of 400 metric tons. Next up are India and China, but their numbers are pretty small. Overall, the list is really short, especially considering that 32 countries around the world generate nuclear energy. But let's get back to France. According to the representatives at Orano Group, 96% of spent fuel can be reused. Thanks to recycling, the volume of most radioactive waste is reduced by 5 times, and its radiotoxicity drops by 10 times. In the long run, of course, recycling also cuts down the industry's need for natural resources. For example, 10% of French nuclear power comes from recycled materials, and in the future, that number could go up to 30%. How exactly does recycling work? I think it's best to see it all with your own eyes, so we're heading to the largest recycling plant in the world in the commune of La Hague. It's a one-of-a-kind place. So to start off, I'll give you a rough idea. In the process of recycling spent nuclear fuel, the fission products, which are radioactive and can't be recycled, are separated from uranium and plutonium, because uranium and plutonium can actually be reused. So in a way, the factory's kind of like a mine here too. Radioactive elements needed for the country's energy are being extracted. The fission products, which are about 4% of the total amount, are sent for final disposal. They're pretty much useless. Well, at least for now. People haven't figured out how to use them. 2/3 of the plant in La Hague are underground, and the building is basically an underground maze with 24,000 rooms. I'm not kidding, there really are that many. Workers at the factory are required to wear protective suits because it's essential for safety. Any contaminated nuclear particles, if they happen to get on a person, will stick to these suits, meaning they won't leave the factory grounds. In these casks, used fuel arrives at the plant, the casks have special protection, and even though there's extremely dangerous radioactive material inside, being around them is harmless for people. You can even quickly touch them. The workers, though, say that if you get really close to the cask, you can sometimes feel the heat coming from the spent fuel. Every day, one of such casks arrives at the plant. Mostly, the spent fuel comes from French facilities, but sometimes waste from other countries is brought here, usually from the Netherlands, Australia, and Japan. But it's not enough to just bring in the spent fuel, it also needs to be taken out. In this chamber, the fuel rod is removed from the container. People don't handle it directly, the process is done remotely from the control room. Next, the rod moves into a room with a pool for cooling, because let me remind you, it's damn hot, 400 to 600 degrees Fahrenheit. So the water in the pool keeps getting warmed up, but there's a circulation system in place to keep the temperature stable. The warm water drains out and cools down, and cold water is poured in to take its place, and so on. Standing next to a pool like this is still safe, but only because there are 13 feet of water over the rods, a kind of protective layer. Here, the rods soak for about 5 to 7 years, which is how long it takes for them to cool down enough before moving on to the next step of processing, separating the fuel into useful and useless components. This happens in a lab, in special windowless rooms where the operator uses sensors, robots, and drones to navigate. Again, there's no direct contact. But I don't want to get into the chemical details of the separation. It's pretty complex info, better suited for a serious science video. What's important, as I mentioned, is that in the end we get 3 products: uranium, plutonium, and fission products. Uranium that forms after reprocessing can be sent back to the power plant and put back into the energy generation cycle. Plutonium is also super useful. 0.03 ounces of it can replace 1 ton of oil, but the main reason why almost no one on the planet is dealing with reprocessing spent nuclear fuel is because of plutonium. Spoiler alert, it's all about nuclear bombs. Keep this in mind, we'll come back to it later. So we know what to do with uranium and plutonium too, but what about the useless leftovers? They're stored in a separate space that looks like a huge hangar. See the decay products? They're right on the floor. They put them inside special glass for extra safety and then hide them in a huge underground storage. The floor. It, by the way, is 6.5 feet deep, and all this space is filled with canisters stacked 9 on top of each other. 18 of these containers hold all the waste products created by one nuclear power plant in a year. But these are processed waste, otherwise they wouldn't even fit in a whole warehouse. You'd need a space 5 times larger. And here you might wonder, what will they do when the storage gets completely full? It's simple. They'll just build a new one right next to it. Construction's already in the plans. What's the takeaway here? Fission products that can't be used take up less space and the world gets more fuel for making energy. But France's case is unique in its own way, and not many are willing to take the risk with recycling. We're basically giving up 90% of the energy we could be getting. Why? To figure it out, you need, well, I wouldn't say no to another cup of coffee, because physics is a tough nut to crack. But basically, you need to understand how we get energy from nuclear fuel. Essentially, it forms when an atomic nucleus splits apart. Uranium-235 really loves to split. When it hits a neutron, the nucleus breaks apart, releasing new neutrons, which then hit other nuclei, and that's how a chain reaction of fission happens. A ton of heat is released in the process. This heat warms up the water in the reactor, steam is released, and that steam in turn powers the turbines. Voila! And we get electricity. However, when the fuel stays inside the reactor for a few years, uranium starts absorbing the neutrons produced by the fission of nuclei, slowing down and weakening the chain reaction. When this happens, the fuel becomes spent, and that means it needs to be replaced. Otherwise, nuclear power plants just can't reach their maximum efficiency. Using fuel past its shelf life is simply less cost-effective and a lot more dangerous. Although there are other kinds of reactors that can squeeze out more energy, they're super pricey, super complex, and nearly all of them are experimental. So yeah, you can get more than 10% energy, but it means big expenses and significant risks. It's simpler to get some fresh fuel than to deal with the old one. There are reasons for not doing recycling. Some researchers think it raises the risk of nuclear terrorism. Remember plutonium? Well, it's the very thing that makes nuclear bombs, nuclear bombs. catastrophically destructive, and deadly dangerous. Nuclear weapons are made with special military tech, but you can also use plutonium from recycled fuel to make them, and figuring out where the recycled plutonium went is no easy task. History has literally seen an example of a country creating nuclear weapons out of nowhere. It happened on May 18, 1974. That's when India shocked the world by conducting a test explosion of a plutonium bomb. This plutonium was extracted from a regular, peaceful research reactor gifted by the Canadian government back in 1954. Indian scientists literally took the Cirrus nuclear reactor provided by Canada and the heavy water supplied by the United States and created material for a nuclear bomb. The preparation for the test and the detonation were carried out in extreme secrecy, and very few people outside the group of scientists knew about the test. In part, India's nuclear test caught everyone off guard because this event clashed with the world's nuclear non-proliferation treaty. India wasn't a signatory to this treaty, and after those unexpected tests, it was isolated from nuclear trade and cooperation for 34 years. This isolation finally came to an end in 2008. The incident with the sudden explosion scared other countries, and in particular the US government, so much that, we're just getting to the second reason why processing nuclear fuel is so unpopular. It's seen as a threat to global security. In 1977, the US president decided to put off commercial reprocessing of spent nuclear fuel indefinitely due to the risks of leaking nuclear technology or materials from the plants. To put it simply, he was understandably worried that the situation with India might repeat itself, but not in such a peaceful way. This decision was justified by the fact that the United States could keep its nuclear energy program going for the foreseeable future without reprocessing, and that commercial reprocessing could encourage other countries to expand their reprocessing activities too. And this brings us back to the nuclear bomb that popped up out of nowhere. So the US decided to set a good example for the sake of the common good and the planet's safety. So for a while, the processing of spent nuclear fuel was banned by law in the US. Nowadays, the US sticks to a policy of burying spent fuel directly without recycling it, but opinions on so-called nuclear waste are gradually changing. So if we skip all the back and forth, recycling is no longer banned by law, but the president's administration has the right to limit or ban commercial recycling. This creates issues for private investors and some confusion. Well, right now, the U.S. is building a big recycling plant that'll report to the Department of Energy. It seems like private companies still can't set up something like this, but they're not totally shut out either. In short, things are complicated, and it's still unclear where the industry is headed in the future. It's quite possible that everything will change after the upcoming presidential election. But to a degree, the reason nuclear fuel isn't reused is because it's just complicated and dangerous. See for yourself. It usually stays in the reactor for, well, on average, about 5 years. About once a year, 25 to 30% of the fuel is taken out and replaced with fresh stuff. And if at the beginning, before it's used in the reactor, the fuel is only slightly radioactive, over time the radioactivity increases, and along with it, the danger. Even after being pulled from the reactor, even though the splitting reaction is stopped, the spent fuel keeps generating heat from the decay of elements. When fuel is extracted, it's already considered highly radioactive. This means the processing needs to be closely monitored and carried out at top-notch facilities by very qualified staff. At the same time, the rules for handling fresh fuel aren't as strict. There's less oversight, fewer rules, and safety measures, and while I did my best to explain the recycling process as simply as I could, hope I managed it, in reality, it's super complicated. So much so that not every country has the know-how and tech to handle it on an industrial scale. Plus, using new fuel is just cheaper. A simple example. The UK worked on recycling nuclear fuel for a while, but they had to shut down the programs. The process was way too expensive. Japan has been building its own recycling plant for several decades now, but the construction keeps getting delayed and the project's cost keeps going up. So that French factory costs just an insane amount of money. It's big, with a lot of staff and top-notch security. It's way easier and cheaper to just mine the ore, extract energy from it, and then just throw it away. Well, okay, put it in storage. As strange as it may sound, uranium prices are still pretty low. There's still a lot of it on the planet, and there don't seem to be any good reasons to go for processing. And as long as the recycling process stays this expensive, doesn't look like anything's going to change anytime soon. Although people can't continue to just pile up spent fuel containers indefinitely, the planet won't run out of space, but the problems will only escalate. But wait, where does the plutonium go after being processed at the French plant? Apparently, everything related to plutonium is handled with the utmost secrecy. The purified plutonium is shipped all over the country under Army escort. They ship it off to another plant where plutonium is mixed with uranium to create mixed oxide fuel, which then gets sent back to the nuclear reactors. Thanks to this fuel, the plants can use 30% less pure uranium, and plutonium travels around the country. A lot of energy. In the United States, there are 55 nuclear plants with 93 active reactors. Meanwhile, 26 reactors are at various stages of being shut down. But even so, during the operation, nuclear plants produce a huge amount of waste. According to data from CNBC, the U.S. has about 80,000 metric tons of spent fuel from nuclear reactors. Plus, the current nuclear fleet produces around 2,000 tons of spent fuel each year. The interesting part is that all this hazardous waste would be enough to power the country for 100 years. Technologies that allow nuclear waste to be turned into energy have been around for a long time and are known as fast reactors. Even more, they were tested in the U.S. from the 60s to the 90s, but because of economic and political complications, commercial use of these reactors didn't happen. Well, remember, an example to the world, right? Now, due to the nuclear waste problem, fast reactors are back in the conversation. So why not go for it if it helps get rid of some waste and gives us energy? Actually, they are being used, but just not everywhere. Right now, Russia is the only country where fast reactor technology is actively used for electricity production. India and China are also planning to build such reactors on a commercial basis in the future. In 2019, the U.S. Department of Energy announced they were starting work on their own test reactor, but funding for this project wasn't in the federal budget. Experts against the plant. We've gone through the whole video going over the pros and cons of reusing nuclear waste, and it seems like experts in the U.S. only see cons. They claim that the initiative to recycle spent nuclear fuel goes against the country's nuclear safety policy. It all started when Shine Technologies and Orano signed a memorandum of understanding to set up a nuclear waste recycling plant. The plant's expected to start operating in the early 2030s with a production capacity of 110 tons per year. But what's the problem here? According to experts, building such a facility in the U.S. could set a precedent for other countries and raise the risk of nuclear weapons proliferation and terrorism. I've mentioned this before. Yes, some countries like France practice recycling nuclear waste, but experts in nuclear non-proliferation believe that the potential supply chain for waste in the U.S. would be significantly more extensive, increasing risks. Simply put, nuclear waste could be intercepted on its way and turned into a nuclear bomb. Again, as we've seen with India, this is a real possibility. On the other hand, a representative from Orano, which is involved in building the plant, said that the new transportation method takes nuclear non-proliferation issues into account. At the same time, the process allows for extracting commercially valuable materials. Construction of the plant has already been backed by 11 former U.S. officials, so it's pretty likely that the plant will be built. Nuclear plants under threat. Yeah, it's not just nuclear waste that's at risk, but the nuclear power plants themselves, too. There are 444 nuclear power plants operating in 30 countries around the world, as well as 243 research reactors used for isotope production and training specialists. Plus, there are hundreds of uranium enrichment plants and fuel production facilities. The biggest risk is that some of these sites store materials that can be used. Yep, I'm talking about nuclear bombs again. There's also the risk of nuclear plants being seized to trigger accidents similar to Chernobyl or Fukushima, which would release radioactive substances over large distances. These concerns haven't come out of nowhere. Back in October 2012, Greenpeace supporters broke into 2 nuclear plants in Sweden, cutting through the gates and climbing over the fences, with security guards unable to stop them. 4 activists spent the night on the roof of the reactor and only surrendered the next morning. Here's another example. In 2014, someone tampered with the lubrication system of a nuclear power plant turbine in Belgium, causing it to shut down for 5 months. The Belgians were lucky to get off easy. Cyber attacks can do a ton of damage too. Back in 2010, the Stuxnet virus slipped into the computer systems at Iran's nuclear facilities, triggering equipment breakdowns. You get the idea. Nuclear power plants must be protected. But how exactly do you do it? For example, Sweden's nuclear regulator decided to strengthen nuclear plant security by having the military guard them and adding extra safety protocols. Meanwhile, in the US, it's even more serious. There, security has become a major part of the workforce at nuclear power plants, making up as much as a third of all employees. In the past, outside companies were often hired to handle safety, but now a lot of nuclear facilities prefer to employ guards directly. Plus, to maintain high safety standards, American nuclear plants are required to hold regular drills. Nuclear record. In recent tests at a European tokamak, a device with powerful magnets, scientists reached an incredible level of high fusion power. Over just 5 seconds, 69.26 megajoules of energy were released using only 0.000007 ounces of fuel. To get an idea of the scale, you'd normally need 4.4 pounds of coal to produce that much energy. Of course, the tokamak used a different kind of fuel, a mix of 2 heavy hydrogen isotopes, deuterium and tritium, which are expected to power future fusion power plants. Despite setting a record, this specific tokamak, called JET, isn't meant to hit the energy targets expected from future power plants. Instead, it's a stepping stone for large-scale prototypes like ITER and DEMO. But if all this tech isn't planned for use in power stations, what's the point? The thing is, those magnets in tokamaks confine the plasma required for a fusion reaction like the one happening in the Sun and other stars. To recreate something similar here on Earth, we have to create extreme conditions, like heating the plasma to over 180 million degrees Fahrenheit. So does this mean we're making our own sun here on Earth? Is there a disaster movie about that yet? Waste graveyard. Have you ever wondered what happens to nuclear submarines when they reach the end of their service life? There's actually a special place just for safely taking them apart. When nuclear submarines become unusable, they're taken to Trench 94. This trench serves as a sort of graveyard where spent parts of nuclear submarines are buried for good. Of course, this place is carefully designed and protected against the negative effects of radioactive materials, so there's no need to worry about the environment. Well, you could worry a little bit, but not too much. But submarines aren't just tossed into the trench to rust away. Don't forget about the nuclear aspect. First, they cut the reactor hull into pieces to extract the active zone and nuclear fuel, and then all this is sent to a research lab in Idaho. The subs are placed in specialized containers called dry casks, which are then sent down rivers. After that, they're carried by trucks to Washington State, where Trench 94 is located. The containers are placed in a trench that's nearly 1,000 feet long, and according to the latest data, there are about 136 of these storage sites in that area. You owe me a like. See you later.